how did all this life get here? Well, of course that's biology, right? But I mean, let's think quite simply. Everything that's alive dies eventually, right? I mean, I don't think there's anything that stays alive more than a few thousand years. I mean, maybe there is, but I'm no expert zoologist. But most stuff dies within like 1,000 years or something. But life has been around for millions and millions of years. So why? Well, obviously the reason is that what's alive today isn't the same as what was alive when life began, right? What's alive now is just like a copy. An animal or an organism will make copies of itself, imperfect copies. I mean, that's what we call self-replication, right? Right? So, self-replication, the point I'm trying to get across, is that self-replication is pretty damn important because it's actually the reason that everything is around today. Self-replication is the thing that made life spread across the world. Well, think about the Earth, okay? For billions and billions of years, it was just a ball of rock. That is, so far as modern science understands it. It was just a lifeless ball of rock. And then, somehow, these chemicals came onto the Earth, or were on the Earth, and suddenly, these structures were able to create copies of themselves. And from that point on, from the point where self-replication kind of got invented or first came about, from that point on it was a runaway train. And it was almost inevitable then that the world was going to be filled with all of these complex organisms. Why? It's because of this, right? Once something starts copying itself, the numbers of those things are going to increase exponentially, right? Soon there's going to be millions and millions and millions and millions of them, and they're all going to carry on copying themselves. And if something's copying itself, but maybe not perfectly, if there's a little bit of error, a few mistakes, well, you know what that means, don't you? That means we're going to have evolution. It means that the bad copies die, the good copies create more copies, and soon or later we get diversity and we get all kinds of amazing competing organisms leading to some kind of massive ecosystem like we have on Earth. So self-replication is the key to it all. Apart from explaining why we are here, why life is here, how diversity arose, and explaining many things about our past, I think that the idea of self-replication is going to have an enormous effect on the future. Let me try and explain. Up until now, people have created our technology. I mean, no doubt there's been a massive increase in the amount of technology in the world. But all of the technology around at the moment has been made by people, or it's been made by machines which are essentially operated by people. And so at the moment, the whole system is quite fragile. But I think it's almost inevitable, given the sort of acceleration of technology and things, it's almost inevitable that sometime, probably pretty soon, someone's going to manage to make a machine which can self-replicate. So, I mean, just think for a moment about what that will actually mean, if you can. I mean, I think it's difficult for anyone to truly get their head around this idea. But if we can make machines that can self-replicate, then just like the first single-celled organisms, which ended up creating the entire ecosystem of Earth, those self-replicating machines are going to make more and more and more machines. Those machines are probably going to be able to change themselves, maybe even to consciously select what kind of course of evolution they're going to take, essentially there's going to be a new kind of life emerging on this planet. And I think when that time comes, it's going to be the most dramatic change in the history of life on this earth that's probably ever going to occur. So what I've done here is I've written a very simple program to represent self-replication. I mean, this program is so simple it's almost laughable. Here it is, I'll run it. Right, so this system shows the number 1, and it has a rule. The rule says replace every 1 with 1 1. So here we are. This is the first step of the system. Now let's evolve it. So we replace every 1 with a 1 1. There we are. Now we replace every 1 with a 1 1. And there we go. Replace every 1 with a 1 1. There we go. And we carry on. Da 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 da. Okay, so what I want to do now is to show you a form of self-replication, which is a bit more interesting. Actually, this is a kind of self-replication which is a lot more difficult to do, but it sort of reveals a lot more about why making a self-replicating machine is difficult, and about how it is actually possible. So, instead of here, where I have a program which essentially just makes this string copy itself, I'm actually going to show you a program which can copy itself. This is a really interesting idea from computer science called a quine. And I did a quick search on Google, and I found this guy's website, Monkey Wrench apparently. This is his website. And on his website, he has some quines in Mathematica. Now, I presume that he's invented these himself, and here is a Mathematica quine. So, Mathematica is just a computer programming language, and this is a code, and when I run it, if it's truly a quine, it should produce a copy of itself. Now, let me just say that I haven't actually executed this before, so I'm not really sure what it's going to do. Hopefully it's not going to reformat my hard drive. Let's give it a try. And there we have it. It's produced a copy of itself as output. So here is a code that can actually output itself. In a way, this is self-replicating. If I execute this code again and again and again, every time I execute it, it makes a copy of itself. Now this is something quite a lot more remarkable. I mean, how do you make something which contains the instructions to make itself? It's quite an interesting kind of idea. In fact, people have known in computer science and things that this is possible, and in fact inevitable in many different kinds of computer languages. Now, I'm not going to talk about the details of this, but I just want to show you that this kind of thing is easy to do. This is John von Neumann, and he was one of the great geniuses of the last century. People say that when this man was 6 years old, he could divide 2 8-digit numbers in his head. Okay? So he was a pretty clever cookie, and he had some very important ideas to do with self-replication. So, about the time that this guy was doing his research, computers were just starting to be developed, and the acceleration of technology was apparent. And the story goes that John von Neumann thought to himself that could computers or technology take over the world? And he reasoned that the only way that technology could truly sort of take over the world and overthrow us humans or as biological beings would be if it could actually self-replicate itself, so that it wouldn't have to rely on people to build it. And so he set about trying to find whether a machine could self-replicate itself. So the idea of self-replication is intimately related to these things called cellular automata. So what is a cellular automata? Well, basically the idea is just that you have some kind of arrangement of cells of different colours, and then the colours of those cells are going to change over time, just dependent on simple local rules. For example, if I'm white and there's 3 black cells around me, turn green, or something like that. So basically the way that the colours of the cells change is just governed by some really simple rules, like maybe 5 or 6 little instructions. So here's one of the most famous examples of cellular automata. This one's called Conway's Game of Life, and I downloaded this nice little app as part of the Google Chrome package. So anyway, you can see here that we've got all of these interesting patterns developing here, and the rules behind this system are very, very simple. But you can see that there's a lot of interesting stuff going on here. So anyway, John von Neumann actually invented cellular automata just to shed light on the idea of self-replication. What John von Neumann did was that he was able to create a cellular automata which had a fairly intricate pattern inside it. And just like those little patterns you saw on Conway's Game of Life, this thing bubbled around and it changed quite a lot, but what his pattern could actually do was self-replicate itself. And moreover, this pattern was complicated enough that it could essentially perform universal self-replication. So essentially, what John von Neumann showed was that it is possible to make a mechanical, self-replicating, universal computer. And moreover, that these things can occur quite easily within general mathematical systems. Essentially, this guy proved that computers can take over the world. So as you can see, quite a lot of work's already been done on self-replication. So you may be wondering, what kind of new things can I actually bring to the table? Well, I think that figuring out whether self-replication is possible, how it can be achieved, these are things which have been researched a lot. But what I want to talk about are the consequences of self-replication. So, for example, I want to talk about this model here, which I developed while I was researching in Sheffield a few years ago. So, the idea here is that we take a network, and then we just imagine that these vertices here self-replicate. So it's a very, very simple system. All we say is that every time step, every vertex replicates. It has an offspring, and the offspring is just connected to the same things as the parent is connected to. That's all there is to the model. We just keep updating again and again. So here, for example, every vertex has an offspring, these green vertices, and they're linked to the same things as their parents will link to. So this is the offspring of this, and this is linked to this and that, because its parent was also linked to this and that. And so this is a very simple system with self-replication. And what this model is teaching us is how some kind of social network might change as organisms self-replicate. Okay, so here's another model. It's a kind of a variation on the theme. This time our offspring are only linked to their parents, and so we get these kind of tree-like structures growing out. But again, what we're seeing here are structures which are in some sense produced because of self-replication. Okay, but what I'm really interested in here is what kinds of surprises can self-replication bring? I mean, when all these things are growing and self-replicating, what kinds of interesting things can happen? Well, if we just let things copy themselves, and that's all that happens, then basically, eventually, there's just so many objects we can't keep track. And in some sense, it's difficult for things to get really exciting. So maybe just like real life, in order for things to get really, really interesting, there has to be an element of danger, and maybe even an element of death. Okay, so let's have another look at this system. Remember, the offspring are just linked to their parents. So you could think of this as some kind of very, very primitive type of family tree between women, say. So, in this family tree, a vertex is just linked to its parents, okay? So, the daughter is friends with their parents, you see? That's why there's a link. And then let's say that both of these, they also have daughters again. Again, the daughter is linked to their parents. And then again, suppose that all of these individuals have offspring. So you can see that the way that this network's developing shows you something about how this social network is growing. And actually these numbers here on these vertices, these correspond to the ages of the vertices, how long they've been around. But hang on, we're missing something here, right? We're missing something very important that happens in real biological systems, and that is death. So what about if we introduce the idea of death? Let's just say that after a system's lived for more than 2 time steps, it dies of old age, let's say. So let's go back, let's run the system again. Let's see what happens. We start with one vertex, it's of age 0. It grows older and it reproduces. Things grow older and reproduce, and so on. So what happens here? These individuals reproduce, and then this one here, it's too old, right? So it dies. And what has happened here? Something very, very interesting just occurred. What happened? Well, the old vertex died, but what happened to the network? Do you see it's actually broken up into lots of different pieces? Well, what do you suppose is going to happen now if we carry on running the system? Well, things get older and it all carries on. And look, this structure here is now broken apart again. So this picture here represents what's going on. One age 0 vertex makes this configuration here, an age 1 and an age 0. This grows up into this, and then this structure here, it actually breaks up. When we update this, we get one copy of this, one copy of this, and one copy of this. And so what we're actually getting here is something quite remarkable. We kind of pre-programmed the idea for these original vertices to self-replicate. But what we're actually seeing here is that what this leads to is global structures which are also self-replicating. In fact, if you think about it, this is quite similar to the idea that we have in biology, where all of these different single-celled organisms actually end up generating self-replicating things like us. I mean, the bacteria and all the different things living in our body, these are tiny little self-replicating things, but we're kind of big things which are made out of these self-replicating little things. Very interesting to think about, and it's quite nice to see these things occurring. Okay, so what I want to show you now are some more interesting kinds of models which involve self-replication. Okay, so the idea of these systems is, just like before, we have this network. We just imagine that these vertices are going to self-replicate, right? So they reproduce themselves. So again, our rule is that the offspring are born with the same neighbours as their parents. Okay, so offspring inherit their parents' neighbourhoods, like animals inherit their parents' surroundings and so forth. And again, we're going to include death. But here, we're going to include death in a kind of different way. We're not going to think of our vertices as dying because they get too old. No. These vertices are going to die of starvation. So what we're going to say, in this case, is that when a vertex has got more than 4 neighbours, they die. Okay? Just like, if you think of these links as representing food sharing, it's just like if you have to compete with too many individuals for food, you're going to starve, right? So that's kind of how these systems work. So let's see them evolving. And I think in my entire research career, what I saw evolving in these kind of systems was probably the most interesting and surprising thing I ever saw, to be quite honest. Anyway, let me show you. So we start off with just 2 vertices linked by an edge. And they both reproduce. Now we've got 4 vertices, we make a line. Now we let the vertices reproduce, and then we kill the vertices which have more than 4 links. And so the degree of a vertex, that's the number of links it has, okay? So this is what we get. And now we update the system again. So we let each of these vertices reproduce, and then we destroy every vertex with more than 4 links. Every vertex with more than 4 degree. And what do we get? This is what we get, okay? Look at the shape. It's kind of like a hexagon with these 6 legs. It looks like a kind of butane molecule. And we also have these 2 vertices which have kind of dropped off. So, can you think about what happens to these vertices? Well, when we update, that vertex is just going to have an offspring. And since the parent is connected to Nout, the offspring will be connected to Nout, okay? So these isolated vertices are just going to make swarms of isolated vertices. Anyway, let's just update the system and see what happens. This is what we get on the next time step. So, we started off with 1 edge, and now we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 edges. So again, we're seeing a kind of self-replication happening. Self-replication on a microscopic scale, in terms of the vertices reproducing, but also on a macroscopic scale, in terms of the connected structures actually reproducing. But we've got something else happening here, which I think is a lot more interesting. We started off with just an edge, and now we've got 6 edges, and we've also got some single vertices. So what's happening here is, not only are these structures self-replicating, they're diversifying. Now, if we just carry on evolving this system, nothing new is going to happen, right? We'll just end up with 6 copies of these butane molecule things, and then we're going to end up with 36 edges and lots of vertices, and so on and so forth. So here are the rules behind these degree cap reproduction systems. We start off with some network, and we keep updating it. Now every update has 2 stages. The first stage we call reproduction. We can think of this a little bit like the springtime if we're trying to draw an analogue with an animal social network. In the reproduction stage, every vertex has an offspring with the same neighbourhood as the parent, just like before. Well, there's an extra stage here that we call the killing stage. Now in the killing stage, we remove every vertex which has a degree greater than d. And so every time we update the system, we do this, which kind of corresponds to springtime when animals reproduce, followed by this, which kind of corresponds to wintertime when harsh conditions destroy animals which have to share resources with too many others. And remember here, the degree of a vertex is just the number of edges touching it. So the degree of this guy here is 5. When you've got degree cap 4, this is what you get. I just showed you these dynamics. We start off with a single edge, and then we reproduce and we destroy everything with degree greater than 4, or we end up with this.
and then we reproduce and destroy everything with degree greater than 4, then we end up with this. And then this thing grows up into this kind of butane thing here, and when we update again, we end up with 6 copies of the original edge. Now, you might remember there was also some extra kind of single vertices, but let's just not worry about them, okay? So essentially this diagram here is showing us how these structures are self-replicating. Okay, so now let's have a look what happens when we set our degree cap to be equal to 6. And so now every update consists of, like before, we give every vertex an offspring with the same neighbourhood as its parents, but this time we destroy all the vertices which have more than 6 connections. So when we update this, just like last time, we end up with this kind of butane molecule thing here. And now let's think about what happens when we update this. Well, we're going to give all of these an offspring, inheriting its parents' neighbourhood, and then we're going to destroy all the vertices which have more than 6 connections. Okay? So what's going to happen? Well, this is where our evolution is going to diverge from the last one we saw. Because when we update this, we don't get 6 lines, we get this. It's more complicated, okay? So, of course, when we make our degree cap bigger, things are going to run for longer before they break up. So we'll keep evolving this and just see what happens. It's getting bigger. And now, look, it's broken up into 6 of these kind of cross-shaped structures and lots of singletons. And if we keep evolving it, what's happening? It's more complicated. And more complicated. Now we've got some very interesting structures here. And can we update it once more? Take a time to display. Look at this now. We've got all of these different kind of butane shaped molecules here, and we've also got some line structures here. So what we're seeing here is, again, not only are these things self-replicating, they're also diversifying in the kinds of structures created. Okay, so this diagram here represents the different kinds of structures a bit more clearly. So what's happening here, we started off with just this thing here, and then this grows up and it grows up and it grows up into this kind of butane molecule thing, and it keeps growing and it keeps growing into this. This is the biggest structure that we get, and it has a lot of symmetry. I think it looks very pretty. And then when we update this, again, we give every vertex an offspring with the same neighbourhood as the parent, and then destroy every vertex with degree greater than 6. We end up with 6 of these cross-shaped things. And then we update each of these, they kind of grow up into a funny thing like this, and this is where something interesting happens. Remember, we've got 6 of these, and now what happens? Well, each of these makes 1 more of the thing we started with, and 3 of these. So what we end up with is we end up with 6 of these, and what? 18 of these, right? So we've got some of these and some of these, and then everything carries on running. So what we're actually seeing here is diversity increasing, which is quite remarkable, because this is essentially the kind of thing that happens with life. We start with a few things simply self-replicating, and then the diversity starts increasing, and all kinds of other interesting things happen. So okay, we saw the dynamics when the degree cap was 4. They were like this. And when we increase the degree cap to 6, things get more interesting like this. So a natural question then is, what happens when the degree cap is 8? It seems like when the degree cap is higher, the dynamics get more and more interesting. So let's have a look. Set the degree cap up to 8, and let's run the system. Wow, things are getting pretty interesting. And look at this now, we're getting this massive structure here, And if we just keep updating, what is going on here? Well, it's getting pretty interesting. Nothing's even broken up yet. We keep updating it. And it's getting difficult for my computer to keep up with it because there are so many vertices here. It's getting hard to visualize it. You see, we've got lots of singleton vertices, but it doesn't look like the original structure is even broken up. So what's going on here? Well, this was, as I say, one of the most exciting moments of my research career. We see this break up, but it's broken up into lots of large structures. So what happens when we keep updating? Let's just see if my computer's strong enough to go past this next stage and show the next stage. Let's wait a second. Well, anyway, like I say, these things get difficult to visualize, so I ended up just writing a computer program. Oh, there we are. So I wrote a computer program to keep track of these different structures and just to sort of automatically generate a picture, something like this, of what structures make what other structures. The thing is, though, I wasn't prepared for what I was going to see. This is what I saw. So when I first saw this, I really couldn't believe it. I thought there was something wrong with my computer program. I mean, what this is showing is that just by starting from a single edge and evolving it under this simple rule here, we end up with an entire ecosystem of thousands of different kinds of structures that all grow and change and self-replicate and produce copies of one another. It's really very similar to the idea of life on Earth, where we just started with one amoeba and then we end up with all the diversity. Well, the difference here is that there's no randomness. The only thing that happens is just that all these bits and pieces follow these really simple rules. You know, just involving self-replication and death. And those two ingredients are all you need to create all of this complexity. And so then you may be wondering, well, what happens if we increase the degree cap even further? Well, here's a picture of it. So, again, we start with our graph, which is just a pair of vertices linked by a single edge. That's represented by this point here. And this flow diagram here shows all of the different structures that you get, all the different connected components when you evolve this thing with degree cap 10. So now we're getting some 10,000 different kinds of structures, all of which are growing and changing and self-replicating. And this is just so strange and unexpected. I mean, I can't even keep track of what happens when the degree cap is greater than 10. My computer's just not powerful enough. But one thing is clear. This self-replicative behavior is extremely exotic and interesting. And it's remarkable that it came from such simple rules. I mean, there really seems like a parallel, to me at least, between this and what must have happened on Earth, when sometime a long time ago there was a single amoeba, and now there's an entire civilization, an entire ecosystem of different kinds of self-replicating species. What's different here, though, is that there's no randomness involved. This system evolves just from purely deterministic rules. And there's other strange things. In the case where the degree cap is 8, this single edge ends up producing copies of itself. But when the degree cap is 10, this edge grows up into something over here, and then that breaks up into something which self-replicates. So in this case here, the edge itself does not actually self-replicate. It's kind of an evolutionary dead end, evolutionary cul-de-sac. And so these systems really are truly amazingly complicated. And I'm not even sure in general, for a general degree cap, what happens. I'm not sure if there are any examples where a system grows forever, or whether every initial structure is destined to end up creating a kind of finite collection of self-replicators like this. Honestly, these systems just seem so complicated that they are kind of beyond analysis. I spent a long time studying these systems, and perhaps I spent far longer studying these than any other mathematical system I've worked on. But I haven't gone close to breaking these systems and figuring out what happens. It seems like whatever analysis techniques you apply, somehow the logic always seems to go circular, and the question that you asked always seems to just sort of fold back in on itself, and it's difficult to make progress.
Okay, so now I just want to quickly talk about another kind of system that can also do self-replication. So if you have a look at some of my other videos on my website, you'll learn that I'm also very interested in what are called string rewrite systems. So we can show these evolving through time just by listing the successive strings, like a list of blocks of different colours. So here we start with a red block, and then the second string on the second time step is a red and blue block, then the third string is a red block and two blue blocks. And so as we go down the screen, we're looking at how this string is evolving through time, okay? Have a look at some of the other videos if you want to understand exactly what this system is. But basically, we're showing the rules at the top here, okay? So, for example, this rule says that you replace a blue block and a red block with two green blocks. Well, okay, so essentially this is a string rewrite system. It makes this pattern evolve through time. But if you look at this yellow here, you should notice that actually nothing interacts with these yellow blocks that get produced. In fact, whenever a yellow block's produced, it kind of isolates all the stuff on its left from all the stuff on its right, so that those two sides evolve kind of independently of each other. In other words, we can think of this thing here where we produce yellow blocks as a kind of cutting operation. And so essentially this rule says that when where we see a green and a red block, we cut the string. And so whatever was on the left and whatever's on the right are essentially like two independent strings. And so within this system as well, we also have a kind of death-like operation. I mean, in our growing networks, our analog of death was the idea of just these central vertices getting destroyed for some reason. But here, our idea is that sometimes we put these yellow blocks down, which essentially represent cutting. And so we get that some strings can end up sort of breaking up into multiple independent strings. And what that means is that sometimes these kind of string rewrite systems can have similar types of self-replicative dynamics. Look at this flow diagram here. By the way, all this stuff's on my webpage. You can take a look. But you see this flow diagram here. This is just showing how these different strings produce one another. For example, if we update this string here, red, blue, green, 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 red, blue, we get these two pieces here, because what actually gets produced if you update this is one of these and one of these separated by a yellow block. And this yellow block, as I say, can essentially be thought of as a kind of incision, as a kind of cutting operation. And so this flow diagram here really shows you how all these different strings produce one another. The interesting thing though is that this diagram is not actually complete, and I believe that if you just kept building this, you'd actually get an infinite diagram. In other words, what I'm saying here is that in this system, if we just start with a single red block and evolve it, it appears as if not only all the strings are self-replicating, but the number of different kinds of strings that we're getting just seems to increase. In other words, what I'm saying is that in some sense this rule produces an infinite number of infinitely complicated diverse structures. Now, I can't prove this, it just looks this way from the evidence. This was just one string that I found during my investigation, But certainly I have a lot of evidence that points towards the existence of some incredibly exotic systems involving self-replication. And I think that there's a lot of interesting research that can be done about this, especially considering how interesting it could be to find simple programs that can do self-replication for areas such as nanotechnology.
That's all I have to say about self-replication for today. I'm Richard Southwell, and if you're interested in these topics, please follow the links and maybe you'll be interested in some of my other videos too.